I was sitting on the porch this morning, just sitting there. The coffee was already cold in my hand. I don't remember making it. I don't remember coming out here. But there I was, 11 degrees, November. The kind of morning where the sky looks like it's been ironed flat and gray. And I was sitting there with a cold cup, and my hands were shaking. And I was trying to remember when it started, when the whole thing started falling apart. Because it didn't fall apart all at once. People think it does. They think there's one moment and everything shatters. But it's not like that. It's like watching a house settle, year after year. You hear it creak. You tell yourself it's just the wind. And then one night, the whole foundation gives, and you wake up buried under the roof. My name is Diane. I'm 67. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Mesa. That's not where I plan to be. That's not where I thought I'd end up. But we'll get to that. Let me start where I was 2 years ago, before I knew, before any of it. 2 years ago, I was still in the house on Willow Creek Drive, the one my husband built. 22 years we lived there. White picket fence, 2-story, big backyard with a dogwood tree that my kids climbed when they were little. I used to stand in the kitchen and look out that window and think about how lucky I was. I had a husband named Paul. I had a son named Kevin. I had a daughter named Sarah. And I had money. Not a lot, but I had what I needed. And I had savings, real savings. Money I'd been putting away since I was 30 years old. $50,000 in a savings account at the bank on Route 9. Every month I'd drive there. Every month I'd deposit whatever I could. Sometimes 300, sometimes 200, sometimes just 50 if things were tight. But I did it. For 37 years I did it. And I watched that number grow, slowly, quietly, like a seed under dirt. People don't understand that kind of money. $50,000 to me was everything. It was security. It was freedom. It was the thing that let me sleep at night, knowing that if something happened to Paul, or if I got sick, or if the roof leaked, or if Kevin needed help buying a house, I could help. I never touched that money, not once. Not even when my back went out and I couldn't work the job at the distribution center anymore. Not even when the car needed a new transmission. I left it alone. It was for emergencies. It was for my kids. And I told them that. I told them over dinner. I told them at Christmas. I told them when they visited. I said, I have this money saved for when you need it, for when things get hard. And they would nod, and Paul would nod, and nobody ever said they'd take it. Nobody ever said a word about it. So I assumed they understood. I assumed they respected it. I assumed the money was safe, because I was safe, because I was their mother, because I was their wife, because I had given them everything I had for 40 years. Paul was the first to leave. Not physically, not in the way you'd think. He left emotionally, slowly, like a man who walks out of a room and doesn't come back, but you don't realize he's gone until you turn around and there's no one there. He started sleeping on the couch. That was about 1.5 years before everything happened. I asked him why. He said he liked it out there, said the bedroom got stuffy, said he'd always slept better on the couch. I believed him. I didn't question it. I was 64. I was tired.
I let things slide because I thought, what's the harm? He's sleeping on the couch. That's fine. That's okay. We're together. We're still married. That's what matters. But the truth was, Paul was seeing someone, a woman named Carla, who worked at the golf course. He told me about her 6 months before the money thing happened. He came to me one night and said, I need to tell you something. And I felt my stomach drop. I felt it drop like a stone into a well. But he wasn't confessing. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking me to understand. He said, Carla and I have been talking. He said it's nothing. He said it's just that we're in the same boat and we get along. I said, okay. I said, I understand. I said, let's just go to bed. And I went to the bedroom and I shut the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I stared at the wall, and I didn't cry. I just sat there for a long time, and the silence in that house was so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. I didn't leave him. I want to be clear about that. I know what some people would say. They'd say you should have left. They'd say you deserved better. But I had been with Paul since I was 20. He was my first everything. He was the father of my children. And I thought, maybe if I just loved him hard enough, he'd come back. Maybe the thing with Carlo would blow over. Maybe he'd realize what he had. I held on. I held on because that's what I'd always done. I held on through everything. Then Kevin started coming around more. Kevin is my oldest, 38 years old. He's a good man. I want to say that. I need to say that. He's not evil. He's not a monster. He has his own problems. He's been in debt for years. Credit cards, loans, a house he bought that was too much for him. A wife named Megan who's never liked me. I don't know why. I've never done anything to Megan. I've always tried to be kind. But she looks at me like I'm an inconvenience, like I'm the thing standing between her and the life she wants. And Kevin doesn't see it, or he sees it and doesn't care. He always picks her. So Kevin starts coming over. He says he needs to talk about some financial stuff. He says his car is dying. He says Megan's been struggling. He says, can he take a look at some of my accounts? And I said yes, because he's my son, because I trust him, because I don't think for 1 second that he would take anything from me. I give him the log into my bank, just the savings account, the one with the $50,000. I give it to him and I say, here, look at it, figure out what's best. And he says, okay, Mom, I love you. And he leaves. And I feel good. I feel like I did the right thing. I feel like I'm helping. I'm being a mother. I'm being the person I've always been. That was in March. And then he came back in April. And then again in May. Each time he said he was just looking, just checking, making sure everything was in order. And I let him. I let him because I didn't want to be the controlling mother. I didn't want to be the woman who doesn't trust her own child. So I let him in. I let him look at my money. And I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning. In June, I noticed something. I was at the bank. I always went on Tuesdays. Tuesdays, the line was short. I walked up to the window and I said, I'd like to check my savings balance. And the woman behind the counter typed something and looked at me and said, I'm showing a balance of $11,240. And I said, what? I said, I thought it was $50,000. And she said, that's what the system is showing. And I looked at her, I looked at the screen, I looked at my own eyes in the reflection of the monitor. And I said, no, that's not right. That can't be right. She said, I can pull up the transaction history if you'd like. And I said, yes. And she printed it out, right there, on the little receipt printer. And I took the paper in my hands and my fingers were already shaking. And I walked to the bench by the window and I sat down and I read it. Starting in March, the same month Kevin came to look at my accounts, there were 6 withdrawals. Each one was under $10,000. 8,400, 9,100, 7,300, 6,200, 8,900, 5,500. That's it. That's all the money. Gone. In 4 months. And every single withdrawal had Kevin's name on it. Not mine. Kevin's name. Because I had given him access. Because I trusted him. Because I let him hold the key to everything I had left in this world. I sat on that bench for 20 minutes. I don't know how long. Time stops when something like that happens. The world goes quiet. The people around you become background noise. Someone's kid is crying near the ATM. Someone's husband is yelling at someone on the phone. And none of it matters. None of it exists. There's only you and the paper in your hands and the number that used to be 50,000. That is now 11,240. I called Kevin. He didn't answer. I called again. No answer. I called Paul. He picked up on the 4th ring. He sounded tired. He said, what? And I said, Kevin took the money. And there was a pause. And then he said, what do you mean? And I said, he took my savings. The 50,000. It's gone. And he said, Diane? And then he said, let me call you back. And he hung up. He hung up on me. Right there in that bank with the fluorescent lights buzzing above me. And the receipt paper still warm in my hands. He hung up on me. I drove home. I don't remember driving. I remember getting in the car. I remember pulling out of the parking lot. I remember sitting at a red light on Route 9 and watching the light change from red to green to yellow. And I didn't move. I just sat there. And the car behind me honked. And I didn't move. And then I moved. And I drove home. When I got to the house, Paul was on the couch. He didn't even get up. He said, I'm sorry.
I said, "What are you sorry for?" He said, "I knew." He said, "I knew he was taking money." He said, "Kevin told me last month." I said, "You knew?" He said, "I was going to talk to him." I said, "When?" He said, "Soon." I said, "Soon? You said soon?" And Paul didn't say anything. He just looked at the ceiling. And I stood in the doorway of that living room, and I looked at my husband of 40 years, and he was on the couch in his sweatpants and his t-shirt that I bought him for Christmas, and he couldn't even look at me. And I realized in that moment that I had lost him a long time ago. Not to Carla, not to the golf course. He lost himself. He lost the ability to stand up for me. He lost the ability to say no to his son. And I was just the last person to find out. I called Kevin. Again. He answered on the third ring. I could hear his kids in the background.
His 2 boys, the ones I used to babysit every weekend for 4 years straight. He said, "Hey, Mom." I said, "Where is my money?" He said, "What money?" I said, "Don't do that. Don't play with me." I went to the bank. I saw the withdrawals. I saw your name. I said, "I need you to tell me the truth." And he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Mom, I can explain." And I said, "Explain. Tell me." And he said he needed the money. He said he was drowning. He said Megan's medical bills were crushing them. He said he was going to pay it back. He said he just needed time. And I said, "Time? You had 4 months to take my life savings, and you couldn't even wait until I was dead to take it?" That's what I said. I said, "You could have waited. I was going to die eventually. You could have just waited." And he said, "Mom, please." And I hung up on him. I hung up and I went into the bathroom and I closed the door and I sat on the floor and I pressed my hands over my mouth and I made a sound that I didn't know I was capable of making. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was something lower, something from the bottom of my chest that I didn't know was there, like something had broken inside me that I couldn't put back together. I sat on that bathroom floor for an hour, maybe longer. The clock on the wall said 3:15 when I got there, and when I finally stood up, it said 5:40. 2 hours and 25 minutes on the floor, just sitting there. Paul came to the door. He said, "Diane." I said, "Go away." He said, "Let me help you." I said, "You couldn't help me when I needed you most. You let this happen. You let your son rob me." He said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Your sorry doesn't mean anything to me. Not anymore. Not after what you just said on the phone. Not after you told me you knew. Not after you chose your son over your wife." He stood in the doorway. He didn't come in. He never came in. He just stood there. And I looked at him and I saw the man I married. And I didn't recognize him. His eyes were flat. His voice was empty. He looked like someone who had already left. He looked like a ghost of the man who used to carry me across the threshold on our wedding night. And I said, "Go." And he went. He went back to his couch. And I locked the bathroom door. And I stayed there. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to figure out what to do. I called a lawyer. Her name was Margaret. She had an office on the east side of town. Small office. 2 desks. A paralegal named Debbie who brought me coffee and didn't say much. Margaret told me what Kevin did was technically legal. I had given him access. I had given him the login. Legally, I authorized those transactions. There was no fraud. There was no theft in the eyes of the law. It was a civil matter. It was a family dispute. And I sat in that little office with the window blinds half closed and the fan clicking on and off. And I listened to Margaret explain it to me. And I felt like the floor was opening up under me. Because what she was saying was that my own son didn't break the law. He didn't have to. He didn't need to. I handed him the knife and he used it. And the law said so was okay. Margaret said I could try to argue undue influence. She said if I could prove Kevin manipulated me into giving him access, I might have a case. She said I would need to show that I was not of sound mind when I gave him the information, that I was coerced, that I was pressured. I said I wasn't coerced. I said I gave it freely. She said that makes it harder. She said, "I'm sorry." She said this is a family matter. And I knew what she meant. She meant this is your problem, not the courts, not the laws. Yours. So I decided to go another route. I decided to talk to Kevin again. Face to face. I drove to his house. He lives in Gilbert. Nice neighborhood, brick house, new cars in the driveway. And I sat on his porch and I waited for him to come home from work. And when he pulled in, I saw his face. And I knew he knew why I was there. He didn't even get out of the car right away. He sat in the driver's seat for a minute. Then he got out, and he walked over, and he sat down next to me. And he didn't say anything for a long time. And then I said, "I want it back. All of it. Every dollar." He said, "Mom, I can't." I said, "You can.
I said, you have a job, you make decent money, you have a house that's worth more than you owe on it. You can pay me back. He said Megan would lose her mind. I said, then Megan needs to lose her mind. Because that money was mine. That money was my security. That money was the thing that kept me from worrying about what happens when I can't work anymore. That money was for me. Not for Kevin, not for Megan. For me. And he said, Mom, I know. And I said, then why? I said, why would you do this? And he said, because I was scared. He said he was scared of what was coming. He said he was scared of medical bills. And he was scared of losing the house. And he said he didn't know what else to do. And I said, you had other options. You could have asked me. You could have sat down and said, Dad, I need help. I would have found a way. I always find a way. But you didn't ask. You just took. And he said he knows. And he said he's sorry. And I said, sorry doesn't pay my rent. Sorry doesn't buy my groceries. Sorry doesn't fill the hole you put in my life. He promised he'd pay me back. $3,000 a month. He said it would take over a year. I said, fine. I said, that's fine. And I believed him. I believed him because he was my son. Because I wanted to believe him. Because believing him meant I didn't have to face the full truth of what had happened. So I went home. And I waited. And the first month he sent $1,100. Not $3,000. $1,100. And I sent him a text that said, where's the rest? And he said, things are tight right now. He said, give me another month. And I said, okay. And the second month he sent $800. And I said, Kevin. And he didn't respond for 3 days. And then he sent $400. And I just sat there looking at that number on my phone screen. And I felt something inside me go quiet. Not angry. Not sad. Just quiet. Like a room after everyone has left. The kind of quiet that's so loud it makes your ears ring. The third month he sent $200. And then nothing. I called and he didn't answer. I texted and he didn't respond. I drove to his house. And Megan answered the door. She looked at me and she didn't say hi. She didn't say come in. She just stood there blocking the doorway like I was a salesman. And I said, I need to talk to Kevin. And she said, he's not available. And I said, I'm his mother. And she said, I know who you are. And I said, then let me in. And she said, no. And I said, Megan, I just want to talk. And she said, you took enough from us already. And I said, I didn't take anything from you. You took my money. And she shut the door. Right in my face. Like I was nothing. Like I was a stranger. Like I was the person who broke into her life.
I went back to my car and I sat there, in the driveway, in the sun, the kind of Arizona sun that bakes the pavement until it shimmers. And I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and I breathed. In and out. In and out. And I let myself feel it. All of it. The anger, the sadness, the humiliation, the disbelief. I let it all come in. Because I knew if I held it down any longer, it would break something I couldn't fix. So I sat there and I felt it. And then I drove home. Paul and I didn't speak for a week after that. Not because we were fighting, because there was nothing left to say. The words had been used up. He sat on the couch. I sat in the chair by the window. We ate our meals in silence. We watched TV, but neither of us watched it. We just sat there. Two people in the same house who had nothing connecting them anymore. And one night I came downstairs and he was gone. His shoes were gone, his coat was gone, his side of the closet was empty. He left a note on the kitchen counter that said, I'm sorry, Diane. I know I should have done better. I know I should have stood up, but I didn't. And I'm sorry. And I drove to Carla's, or somewhere. I don't know. I never found out. He just disappeared. Like he had been disappearing for years. Like the leaving had been happening in slow motion, and I was the only one who didn't see it until the room was empty. That was the worst. Not the money, not Kevin, the loneliness. Sitting in that house alone. The two of us in the same space for 40 years, and now it was just me. Me in the silence. Me in the dogwood tree outside the window that was still standing but somehow looked smaller. Me in the coffee maker that still made coffee I didn't want. I started drinking tea. I don't know why. It just felt right. Something small to hold on to. Something to do with my hands when the house got too quiet. Sarah came to visit once. Just once. She drove down from Phoenix. She sat with me on the porch. She held my hand. And I told her about Kevin. And she said, that's horrible. She said, he's a piece of shit. And I said, I know.
And she said, "You should call the police." And I said, "There's nothing they can do." She said, "You should call a lawyer." And I said, "I did." And she said, "What did they say?" And I told her, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "Mom, I don't know what to say." And I said, "You don't have to say anything." And she said, "I'm here." And I said, "I know." And we sat there, and she held my hand. And for a few hours it was enough. It was almost enough. Almost. But Sarah has her own life. She has 2 kids of her own. She has a husband named Todd who works nights. She has a job. She has a life that doesn't have room for me the way it used to. And I understood that. I did. I wasn't angry. I was just tired. I was tired of being the one who needs, the one who asks, the one who reaches out and gets silence back. I started calling less. She started calling less. And that was the other quiet, the quiet between mother and daughter, the slow fade, the way love can become a background noise until one day you realize you haven't heard it in months. I sold the house. I had to. The mortgage was too much. Paul had been paying half, and now he wasn't paying any. I had the $11,000 left, barely enough. The realtor came and took pictures. Strangers walked through my home. They looked at the kitchen I remodeled in 2004. They looked at the bathroom with the tile I chose myself.
They looked at the dogwood tree in the backyard, and they didn't see any of it. They didn't see the woman who scrubbed those floors on her knees when Kevin was a baby and sick with croup. They didn't see the woman who stood at that kitchen window and watched her son grow up. They just saw a house, a listing, a number. I moved into this apartment in Mesa. Small, clean, 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a window that faces a parking lot. The neighbors are quiet, mostly older people, a couple named Bill and Judy on the other side. Bill brings me soup sometimes when he makes too much. I don't know why. Maybe he just does. Maybe kindness is just something some people do without thinking. I sit on the little balcony in the evenings, and I watch the sun go down over the rooftops. And I think about how small everything has gotten. My world used to be that house, that yard, those people. Now it's this: a balcony, a parking lot, a cup of tea. I still have Kevin's number. I haven't deleted it. I don't know why. Maybe because deleting it would mean it really happened. Maybe because keeping it means there's still a door open. A door he never walks through. Last Christmas I texted him, "Merry Christmas." That's all. No anger, no asking for the money. Just, "Merry Christmas." He didn't respond. 3 days later, he sent a text that said, "I know I messed up. I hope you can forgive me someday." And I stared at that message for a long time. And I thought about what forgiveness means. I thought about whether I could forgive him. I don't know. I really don't know. Some days I think I can. Some days I think I can't. Some days I don't even want to. Some days I just want him to feel what I feel. Just for one day. Just to sit on a bathroom floor for 2 hours and let the silence eat you alive. I went to therapy for a while. Dr. Linda. She was nice. She didn't fix anything. She just let me talk. She let me sit in the silence and she didn't fill it. She said that was the point. She said, let the silence be there. Don't run from it. I went for 4 months. Then I stopped. Because I couldn't afford it. And also because some silences you can't pay someone to sit through with you. Some silences you just have to learn to live in. Alone. Paul called me once, 8 months after he left. He called from a number I didn't recognize. He said it was him. He said he was in Prescott. He said he was staying at a place. He didn't say what place. He said he was sorry. He said he missed me. And I said, I know. And he said, do you think we could ever? And I said, I don't know. And he said, okay. And we hung up. And I sat there. And I didn't cry. I just sat there. And the phone was warm in my hand, and the line was dead. And the world was still turning. And I was still here. Still in this apartment. Still watching the sun go down over a parking lot. Still holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. That was a year ago. It's been a year and 4 months now.
And I'm sitting on this porch, and the coffee is cold, and my hands are shaking. And I'm telling you this because somebody should know. Somebody should hear it. Because I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't tell anyone at the bank. I didn't tell the lawyer. I didn't tell Kevin. I kept it in me. For a year. Maybe more. Until it started coming out. Until I couldn't hold it anymore. Until I needed someone to hear the sound I made on that bathroom floor. The sound that doesn't have a name. The sound that comes from somewhere deeper than grief. Deeper than anger.
From the place where you used to believe that the people who love you would never hurt you, and then they do. And you're still here. Sitting on a porch, holding cold coffee, wondering what's left. There's not much. There's not much left at all, but I'm still here. That's the thing. I'm still here. And some mornings that's enough. Some mornings that's the only thing I can hold on to. I get up, I make coffee, I sit on the porch, and I watch the sky. And I let the silence be there. And I don't run from it. Not anymore. The money is gone. The house is gone. The husband is gone. The son won't speak to me. The daughter is fading. And I'm 67 years old in a one-bedroom apartment in Mesa, drinking cold coffee and telling a stranger on the internet the worst thing that ever happened to me. And I don't know if that's brave or just sad, but it's the truth. It's the whole truth. And I'm tired of carrying it alone.